In the winter of 1945, 5 Allied officers are freezing to death in enemy territory. Their guide? Not a soldier, a 22-year-old schoolteacher, hunted by the Nazis. She wasn't trained for war, but she refused to look away. But how did a teacher from a small Slovak town end up guiding American intelligence officers through the most dangerous mountains in Europe, while the Third Reich itself hunted her down? Before we uncover her story, if you enjoy these forgotten tales of courage and defiance, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It truly helps us bring more of these stories from the past to light. Our story begins in 1921 in a small village in Slovakia. Maria Gulovich grew up the daughter of a carpenter in a time when Europe was still healing from the wounds of the First World War. She grew up in Slovakia and became a teacher, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. By 1944, Maria's world had changed beyond recognition. The Nazis had occupied her homeland, the Slovak puppet government was collapsing, and the resistance, made up of partisans, students, and ordinary villagers, was rising. The air was thick with fear and whispers. People disappeared overnight. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Maria was working as a schoolteacher in the town of Humen when her life took a turn that would seal her fate. A local priest asked her to translate some documents for travelers, men who, she was told, needed her help because they didn't speak Slovak. She agreed. What she didn't know at first was that those travelers were members of the Slovak resistance, partisans working with Allied intelligence. The documents she translated weren't harmless letters or sermons. They were coded messages, maps, and communications for the anti-Nazi underground. And by helping them, Maria had unknowingly crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When the Gestapo discovered the resistance network, everything unraveled. The priest was executed, dozens were arrested, and Maria, barely 22, became a fugitive. She fled her hometown with nothing but a coat and a notebook, moving from safe house to safe house, sleeping in barns, forests, and abandoned villages. For months, she moved constantly, never staying in one place. The Nazis were hunting her, and anyone caught helping her would face a firing squad. Still, she didn't stop. Every time she found shelter, she used her language skills to help the resistance communicate with Allied forces. She smuggled notes, translated radio messages, and carried supplies across enemy lines. To the people who met her, she didn't look like a hero. She looked like an exhausted young woman with fire in her eyes. She refused to stop. Then came January 1945. The war was nearing its end, but the fighting in Eastern Europe had grown desperate. Nazi patrols were still scouring the countryside, executing partisans and civilians alike. And somewhere deep in the mountains, a small Allied intelligence team, American OSS officers and British soldiers, was trapped behind enemy lines. They had been gathering information on German movements when a sudden blizzard cut them off from their base. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. The Nazis were less than a mile behind. The Tatra Mountains were no place for humans in winter. Avalanches, cliffs, and sub-zero winds made every step a gamble. When word reached the resistance that a group of Allied soldiers was stranded, they needed someone to lead them out. Someone who knew the language, the land, and the routes through the snow-covered peaks. Maria volunteered. It made no sense. She had no military training, no experience in mountain rescue, and no reason to risk her life. But when asked why she did it, she gave a simple answer. They helped us. It was my turn to help them. The journey began at night. Maria joined the soldiers in a small cabin hidden among the pines. Inside, frost covered the walls, and the men were huddled around a dying fire. Most had frostbite on their hands and faces. Their supplies were nearly gone. Their only hope was to cross the mountains and reach the Soviet-controlled side, a journey of over 60 miles through blizzard and ice. The snow outside was waist-deep. The wind was so strong it erased their footprints instantly. Visibility was almost zero, but Maria stepped forward first, breaking the trail. Her scarf pulled tight around her face. The men followed. Every step was agony. The cold bit through layers of clothing. The snow filled their boots, numbing their legs. The air was so thin they could barely breathe. Several times the group had to stop to drag each other upright. One man's legs had frozen so badly that Maria and 2 others took turns carrying him between them. At night, they huddled under blankets of snow to hide from German patrols, taking turns staying awake to listen for the sound of boots or dogs. Maria moved among them, whispering encouragement, checking on their wounds, forcing them to eat small pieces of bread, even when they had no appetite left. One of the men later wrote in his report, "Without her, we would not have lasted the first night." The next morning, the storm grew worse. Wind speeds hit 60 miles per hour. The path vanished under new snow. They climbed steep slopes on hands and knees, using branches as makeshift poles. At one point, a rope snapped, and a man slid down the icy incline toward a ravine. Maria threw herself flat and caught his arm, holding on with all her strength until the others pulled him to safety. Her hands were raw and bleeding, but she didn't stop. The blizzard raged for days. Temperatures dropped below -20. Their food was gone. One soldier collapsed, then another. Maria refused to leave them behind. She shouted at them, dragged them, forced them to stand, to move, to live. She pushed the men to keep moving, even when they collapsed. On the fourth day, they saw smoke on the horizon, the faint sign of a village. They had crossed the worst of the mountains. When they stumbled into the first Soviet checkpoint, half frozen and delirious, the soldiers could hardly stand. Maria was the last to enter. She turned once, looking back at the path they'd come from, a line of footprints disappearing into white emptiness. She had guided them through hell, and somehow she had survived. When they finally reached safety, the men could barely speak. Their lips were cracked, their faces burned from frost and wind. They collapsed beside a campfire in the Soviet outpost, hands trembling as they warmed themselves. Maria didn't sit. She moved from man to man, checking their frost-bitten fingers, melting snow to pour into cups, urging them to drink. For days they stayed in that remote village, recovering. The locals had little to offer: potatoes, rye bread, a few blankets, but they shared everything they had. Word spread quickly. A young Slovak teacher had led Allied officers through the Tatras, while the Nazis searched the valleys below. Even among hardened partisans, it sounded like myth. When the storm cleared, the OSS officers asked her name again, carefully, respectfully, as though trying to memorize it forever. "Maria Gulovich," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken it aloud in weeks. The group was eventually escorted to a Soviet command post, where arrangements were made for their extraction. For the Americans and British, it meant going home. For Maria, it meant something very different. Returning home was no longer an option. The Gestapo had burned villages suspected of sheltering resistance fighters. Her family's name was on their lists. She stayed with the partisans, helping as a translator for the Allied mission until the war's end. When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, the celebration was brief. Europe was a graveyard of ruins and broken dreams. Maria, still in her tattered coat, stood among soldiers as they sang victory songs in languages she half understood. She had survived the war, but now she faced another kind of uncertainty. When the communists took control of Czechoslovakia, anyone connected with the Western Allies was viewed with suspicion. Maria, who had risked everything for American agents, was now branded as a threat. Once again, she had to disappear. She fled to Austria, then to Germany, joining the waves of displaced people wandering a continent that no longer knew what home meant. She worked wherever she could, sewing uniforms, teaching children in refugee camps, translating letters for families, searching for missing loved ones. Years passed. Because she had worked with American agents, the new communist government considered her a threat. She escaped to Austria, then Germany. One cold afternoon in 1947, an officer from the American military mission arrived at the camp. He was carrying a file and a small envelope. Inside was a letter from the United States. It began simply, "Miss Maria Gulovich, your courage during the Tatra Mountain rescue has come to the attention of the United States government." She was invited to come to America. The same officers she had guided through that storm had not forgotten her. In 1952, she stepped off a ship in New York Harbor, the skyline rising like a dream. The city was loud, alien, alive. She spoke little English then, but she smiled when she saw the men waiting for her at the dock, faces she hadn't seen since that blizzard. They embraced her like family. One of them whispered, "We owe you our lives." Maria settled quietly in the United States, first in Washington, later in California. She never sought attention, never called herself a hero. She worked as a librarian, a secretary, then a teacher again. When asked about the war, she would smile and change the subject. But the world hadn't forgotten. In 1953, she received a letter from the US government inviting her to a ceremony in Washington, D.C. The paper was formal, the language careful, but at the bottom, one line stood out in bold ink. "You are to receive the Medal of Freedom in recognition of your extraordinary courage and humanity." It was one of America's highest civilian honors. On the day of the ceremony, she wore a simple gray dress and pinned her hair neatly behind her ears. Reporters crowded the room, their cameras clicking as she stood before the podium. When her name was called, she stepped forward quietly, her hands trembling slightly. The official presenting the medal spoke about bravery, sacrifice, and the spirit of resistance. He described how a 22-year-old teacher from Slovakia had led a group of Allied officers through blizzards, cliffs, and enemy patrols, without training, without weapons, armed only with courage. When the medal was placed around her neck, Maria didn't smile for the cameras. She simply looked down at the small golden star resting against her dress, as if seeing not an award, but the faces of the men she had saved. After the ceremony, a journalist asked her a question that seemed simple. "Why did you do it?" She paused, her accent still soft, her words measured. "Because they were human," she said, "and so was I." She lived quietly for the rest of her life. No grand speeches, no memoirs. The Medal of Freedom hung on her wall in a modest frame. Visitors said she would sometimes glance at it when the winter wind howled outside, as if she could still see that mountain in her mind. In her later years, she became an American citizen. She never married, though she had friends who loved her deeply. When she died in 2009, few knew her story. There were no crowds, no cameras, just a handful of people who understood that they were saying goodbye to a woman who had once faced an empire and won. But history has a way of resurfacing, especially the kind written not in grand battles, but in footprints across the snow. Today, her name is carved on a plaque at the Office of Strategic Services Memorial, alongside the men she saved. Visitors sometimes stop to read it. Most move on quickly, but a few linger, wondering who she was. Just a name, a teacher, a survivor, a woman who outran an army in a blizzard. Most people never learn her name, but the men she saved never forgot it, because history isn't only made by soldiers or generals. Sometimes it's made by people who never meant to be heroes, people who simply refuse to give up. And that, in the end, was Maria Gulovich. She wasn't supposed to be a hero, but without her, those men would have died.